Assalamu alaikum, dear students. I welcome you to the lecture 5. We are going through the chapter number 2 named Research Methods. The topic which we are going to study today is methods of research. We are done with the observational method. Today we are going to study experimental method. Okay? So let's begin. Experimental method. What is an experimental method? In experimental method, systematic efforts are made to analyze the facts objectively. Okay, it is an advanced and systematized method and is applied in a lab setting. Previously, we are done with the observation method, in which we talked about the natural setting and observation in the natural setting. In experimental method, we create controlled conditions, and then under those conditions we observe the behavior of our subjects. Okay, we present them a stimulus in a controlled setting, and then we check the responses. This is a systematic method of inquiry. This is the systematic method of research. Okay, experimental method scientifically studies the stimulus and response shown by individual. Okay, the interrelation of various variables are studied, and in this method the nature of problem is studied objectively, and hypothetical solutions are found out, and the results are confirmed, or the results confirm or rejected. So experimental method is a controlled method. This method is applied in a lab setting. We present certain stimulus to a client, to us, to our subject, and then we check the responses. We check the relationship between different variables. We check the cause and effect relationship by presenting a stimulus, that which stimulus produces which response. The nature of the problem is studied objectively. By this scientific method, we can produce results, we can produce objective results, which are unbiased results. Okay, there are certain stages of experimental method. Number 1, formulation of a problem. Number 2, hypothesis. Number 3, variables. Number 4, experimental design. Number 5, selection of subjects. Number 6, apparatus. Number 7, control conditions. And number 8, results. So we are going to discuss these stages in detail one by one. Let's begin with the formulation of problem. Okay, at the beginning of experimental method, the problem should be determined. The first step is the formulation and description of a problem. The problem is formulated so that it is clear what is the subject and what is the object of experiment. Okay, once the problem has been formulated, then it is possible to move on to the later stages. So first step is the formulation of problem, that what we are going to study, what we are going to observe. Okay, second stage of experimental method is the formulation of hypothesis. What is an hypothesis? Hypothesis is a tentative statement which we are going to prove right and wrong. Even if the hypothesis is proved wrong, then there will be no effect on research. Okay? Hypothesis is an assumptive solution based on rational arguments, and the results of the experiment confirm the validity of this hypothesis. Okay? Hypotheses are constructed about a problem under study. After formulation of a problem, we formulate or we construct a hypothesis, and then we test that hypothesis. Either it is true or either it is false. We experiment on the basis of hypothesis, on the basis of hypothesis. At least one hypothesis is formulated before the experiment. Okay. Hypothesis can also be called the expected solutions of the problem. Once a problem is formed, then we give a hypothesis regarding that problem. We can make one, two, three, or four hypotheses as well. Okay? A hypothesis is a statement which proves or disproves our problem. Okay? And as I said earlier, even if the hypothesis is rejected, it does not affect the experiment. Okay? Let me give you different examples of hypothesis. We can make hypotheses like hard work can earn us success. Okay, this is my hypothesis that hard work can earn us success. Then now on this hypothesis I will base my experiment that either hard work can earn success or not. Similarly, let me give you another example of hypothesis. uh, the body temperature rises in case of illness or infection. This is another hypothesis. Now, when we experiment on it in controlled conditions, we will check the body temperature of certain ill people and body temperature of normal people, and then we will experiment on them, and then the hypothesis will be proved or disproved. Is it clear? Okay. The third step is formulation or um, indication of variables. What is variable? Variables are actually plural of variable, which means changeable thing. Okay, variables are the changeable things. The thing that can be varied is called a variable. For example, temperature, our emotional states, our ability to react, our ability to memorize, these are the variables. Variables are the changeable things, things that can be changed. Okay, so a hypothesis consists of two variables. A hypothesis consists of two variables. Any change in one variable affects the presence of other variable. Okay, for example, hard work and success. These are two variables of our hypothesis. Hard work can earn us success. Now, two variables, hard work and success. The more the hard work, the more the success. Okay, now there are two types of variables, independent variables and dependent variables. In research methodology, there are two types of variables. What are independent variables? The causes, events, or factors that exist in an environment and appear independently. They are called independent variables. The variables which form the subject of study and which can be varied by the experimenter at any time. Independent variables can be varied, can be changed by the observers. Okay, independent variable is the cause. We can say that these are the causes. For example, um, voltage of light bulb. Hard work is a cause which produces success. Okay, illness can be an independent variable, it is a cause, and so on. Okay. Dependent variable, the variation brought about by the independent variable. This change can take place in client's observable behavior. Dependent variable is the effect, independent variable is the cause. Okay. During the experiment, the dependent variable is studied carefully. Every change is noted, and dependent variables cannot appear independently. Effects do not occur without the cause. Dependent variable do not occur without independent variable. For example, uh, the brightness of light depends on the electric power of the bulb. The brightness of light depends on the electric power of the bulb. The light is in effect, is a dependent variable, and the electric power is the cause, is the independent variable. Clear? Similarly, there can be so many other examples. The intensity of the fever is dependent variable because it is subject to severity of the infection. Okay, hope it is clear. So, apart from these two in variables, types of variables, independent variable and dependent variable, there are certain other variables which are called intervening variables. Such variables can also bring about change in our dependent variables. So there are two types of intervening variables. Number one, internal variables, and number two, environmental variables. So what are internal variables? Internal variables are the internal states of individual which also affect his performance, like his personality, his mental state at that time, his biological responses, his age, experience, intelligence, social status, fatigue, and so on. While doing an experiment, intervening variables are also affecting the behavior of individual. So intervening variables are the internal variables are the internal changeable things of an individual which affect his performance. So, second intervening variable is the environmental variable. What are environmental variables? Environmental variables are the environmental factors such as temperature of the lab, the light in the lab, brightness, noise, the seating arrangement, and so on. These are the environmental variables which affect the performance of an individual in the controlled lab condition. Okay, so these intervening variables, apart from these independent and dependent variables, we also study these two variables. While performing an experiment in the lab, we make sure during the experiment that no intervening variable affects the experiment. Okay, we try our best to control these environmental and internal variables so that they do not affect our results. So, the next stage of experimental design is experimental experimental method is experimental design. Okay, what is experimental design? It is organized and phased methodology which the experimenter adopts prior to the beginning of his experiment. We design our experiment. It is an outline of an experiment. Okay, like experimental design has, you can say, the same importance in experimental method as the map has in the construction of a house. So experimental design is an outline of an experiment. Now, how this experimental design is selected? It is selected in view of the situation, in view of the nature of the problem going to be studied, and what are the goals of study. We design our experimental or we design our experiment on the basis of the nature of problem or view of situation. According to that, we design this experimental design. The next stage of experimental method is the selection of subjects. Okay, in order to study the variables, in order to study the independent variables that are the causes and their effects during the experiment, one or more subjects are selected according to the experimental design. Okay, the minimum number of subjects in an experiment is one. However, we can take more subjects. More subjects can be included if required. Generally, there are two groups of subjects: experimental subject or control subject. What is an experimental subject? The subject that is studied under experimental conditions is called experimental subject. And by relating the variables, we can say that independent variables apply to this group. Okay, we apply independent variables to the experimental subjects. What are control subjects? The control subject refers to the subject or group of subjects, which is studied like the experimental subject, but to which independent variables do not apply. We do not apply independent variable to the control subject. By studying and observing the controlled subject, we can tell whether the change that has occurred in the experimental subject is really due to the independent variable or there is some other cause. Control subjects and experimental subjects should be equal in number. Okay, we in an experimental method we have to form control as well as experimental subjects in order to compare the results of experiment or the effects of independent variable. Actually, in experimental method we are studying the effects of independent variables, the cause and the effect relationship. Let me give you an example. Okay, let's begin with the hypothesis. A break in learning improves performance. Okay, this is my hypothesis that a break in learning improves performance. In this hypothesis, break is independent variable. This is the cause, while better performance is dependent variable effect. ठीक है? Now, we will form control and experimental subjects to analyze the effects of independent and dependent variables. Before selecting subjects, we should take it into account that the subjects of both groups should be almost equal in terms of number, age, and mental ability, and so on. Now, the experimental subjects will be given a break to rest during learning, whereas the control subjects will learn the same material without break. Okay, we are going to check that whether break in learning improves performance or not. For that, we make two groups, experimental and control. We will give break to the experimental subjects and we will not give break to the control subjects. After comparing the results, we will come to know whether a break in learning improves performance or not. Is it clear? So, now coming to the next stage, apparatus, defining apparatus. The equipment needed to confirm or reject a hypothesis is known as apparatus. Okay? The nature of the experiment determines the selection of apparatus. Which apparatus is going to be used is dependent upon the nature of the experiment. Either a psychological test is required, either some sort of experimental apparatus is required, and so on. There are different sort of apparatus like maze box, star patterns, mirror drawing apparatus, Muller-like cards, the psychological test, the personality test, the projective and non-projective techniques of personality test, and so on. Having selected apparatus according to the nature of the subject and nature of the experiment, the experimenter sets out the apparatus, keeping in view the subject's seat and the actual requirement of the experiment. Okay. Now, number seven, seventh stage of experimental design, the controlled conditions. This refers to the conditions or factors that can affect results during the experiment. Okay? The experimenter should have control over them and he should be able to apply independent variables. Okay? Beside control conditions also include control over all types of independent intervening variables as well. I talked about intervening variables, the internal variables and the environmental factors both. In control conditions, we need to control the intervening variables as well. That is, the experimenter should have all factors in his hand from the beginning to the end. This is very important in experimental method that the conditions have been controlled. The experimental and the control conditions are in the hands of experimenter. The last stage is the results. The subject's responses are analyzed. And for this, statistical methods or statistical tools are applied for the analysis of the results. The statistical methods, why these are used? These are used to make it easier to explain and compare the results in tabular forms or in the graphical form. Mathematically, results can be shown in a much precise and better accurate way. In this results report, it is determined whether the results confirm the proposed hypothesis or not, and what is the relationship between the independent variable and dependent variable. Either it is proved or it is disproved. So these were the different stages of experimental design, from the formulation of problem to the results. Hope it is clear. Now, what are the advantages of this experimental method? Experimental method is a scientific method. Because of this method, psychology has gained the status of science. Okay, this method has made psychology earn a status of science. This is a scientific method because we control the conditions, we check cause and effect relationship, we could predict the behavior of individual by producing certain intervening variable, independent variable, and so on. This is a scientific method. Scientifically, we analyze the behavior of individuals. Another advantage is that this method has wide scope. It can be applied to a vast number of individuals. Okay, this the The experimental method can be applied to a wide number of subjects and to a wide number of topics. Study of animals, this method can be applied to animals as well. We can control, we can make conditions, we can control conditions, or we can provide experimental conditions to study the behavior of animals as well. As Ian Pavlov, B.F. Skinner, Edward Lee Thorndike, and many others conducted experiments on animals in their labs. Later on we will study these experiments in detail. Analysis, yes, in this method results can be repeated and analyzed. Because of this, because of this analysis factor, we can scientifically prove our results. Objective, this is also known as objective method. Experimental method is an objective method because it does not allow the choice of experimenter. Conditions have been controlled, experimental conditions apply, cause independent variable is introduced, and we check the results. So we cannot be biased. The experimenter cannot give biased decisions, biased results. Prediction, yes. Another advantage of this result is that it can predict the future behavior of individuals, or the experimenter can predict in the light of his results. And lastly, application to all subjects. Experimental method can be applied to all types of subjects: children, young people, old men, and so on. So, these were the advantages of experimental method. Now, coming to the disadvantages, limited scope. This method has limited scope. The critics contend that this method cannot encompass all topics because all the possible traits or all the behaviors or all the different variables cannot be studied in the lab setting. Okay, so it has a limited scope. Some of the behaviors can only be studied in the natural setting. Some of the behaviors can only be expressed better in a better way in a natural setting. And once an a subject is aware of being tested, being observed in a lab setting, his expressions, his behavior can change. The second disadvantage is the inner subjective states. The inner subjective states can affect the responses of individuals. Fully equipped lab. Experimental method requires a well equipped lab having the capacity to control all the factors. If the lab is not fully well equipped, if there are certain environmental factors that are affecting the behavior, so results will not be valid. So, there are very few labs of this kind which are fully equipped. A lot of money is required to set up a highly sophisticated lab for these highly sophisticated experiments. Advanced learning, the experimenter has to be highly trained to apply this method. Okay? Experimenter should be trained. He should know when to introduce the independent variable, when to control the conditions, and when to debrief the clients, and so on. When the experimenter is not trained, we cannot get better results. Okay. Artificial environment. The environment in the lab, we can say that is artificial and maybe new to the subject. And so this artificial environment can affect the real behavior of the individuals. They may not show the actual responses, the real responses. And lastly, we can say that experimental method involves enormous resources, hard work, and expense. If all resources are provided, it becomes a very expensive method. If all resources are not provided, the validity of the results is affected. Okay, so this was the experimental method. Second research method which we studied today is the experimental method. Now we are done with two methods of research, observational method and the experimental method. In the next lecture, we will be going to study the next two methods, next two research methods. Till then, thank you. Allah Hafiz.